The galaxy was finally beginning to heal from the scars of war. Months after the destruction of the hive mind's control node, humanity's colonies were working to rebuild and regroup. The fleets, battered but not broken, patrolled the outer sectors of explored space. On Kepler Horizon, Jack Livingston walked the familiar corridors with a sense of purpose, his once casual demeanor hardened by the weight of leadership. Sara Johnson, his closest ally and someone he had come to rely on more than anyone else, was busy integrating alien technology into humanity's defenses, a task that carried its own risks. The quiet days felt fragile, as though they were borrowed from a future not yet earned. Jack had learned to appreciate them, but never trust them. The hive mind's fleets had been scattered, their ability to coordinate shattered, but the sheer scale of their operations still loomed over every decision humanity made. For every victory, there was a question: how much had they truly stopped, and how much still lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike? It was during one of those quiet days that the signal came. Jack had just finished inspecting one of the newly retrofitted mining drones in the main hangar when Sarah's voice crackled over his comm. "Jack, you need to see this. Command center. Now." He dropped the inspection report onto a nearby table and jogged toward the command center, his boots echoing in the cavernous halls. The moment he entered, he could feel the tension in the room. Commander Hayes stood by the main console, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Sara was bent over a monitor, her face illuminated by a faint green glow. "What's going on?" Jack asked, stepping beside her. Sara didn't look up, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "We picked up a signal about an hour ago. At first, it just seemed like static, old noise bouncing around in space, but the more I analyzed it, the more patterns started to emerge." Jack leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. It was a stream of distorted data, interspersed with short bursts of clarity, enough to recognize something deeply unsettling. Embedded in the noise were fragments of an ancient transponder code. That's from one of the first colonies, isn't it?" he asked. Sara nodded. "Specifically, one of the founding outposts from Earth's first wave of interstellar expansion. It went dark almost a century ago. No one knows what happened. Most people assumed a catastrophic failure or hostile environment wiped it out." "Most people," Jack echoed, his tone dubious. "You don't seem convinced." "I'm not," Sara said, her voice tight. "And here's the kicker." She tapped a key, and the monitor shifted to display energy readings layered over the signal. "This distortion? It's not natural. It's influenced." Jack's brow furrowed. "Influenced by what?" Sara hesitated. "The hive mind's frequency patterns." Hayes stepped forward, her expression grim. "We don't know if it's a remnant of their network or something else entirely, but the energy signature is unmistakable. It's mixed in with the colony's signal, like an overlay." Jack straightened, his instincts screaming that this was more than just a ghost from humanity's past. "Have we pinpointed the source?" Sara tapped a few more keys, bringing up a map of the galaxy. A distant, uncharted system appeared, far beyond the usual routes of exploration. "It's coming from here, a rocky, uninhabited planet, or at least it was uninhabited last time anyone checked." "Why now?" Jack asked. "Why would a signal from a dead colony suddenly show up with hive mind energy signatures?" "We're not sure," Sara admitted, "but if there's even a chance of survivors, or something worse, we can't ignore it." Hayes nodded. "Agreed, but we can't afford to send a full fleet on a hunch. You'll take a small team and investigate. If it's a threat, we need to know now." Jack met her gaze, his resolve solidifying. "We'll get answers." The shuttle ride to the uncharted system was quiet, the crew subdued as they went over the mission briefings and prepared for the unknown. Jack sat in the cockpit, watching the endless expanse of stars through the viewport. Sara was beside him, running diagnostics on the shuttle's systems. Behind them, 2 soldiers and a communications officer sat in silence, their gear strapped tightly to their bodies. "I don't like this," Sara muttered, breaking the silence. Jack glanced at her. "That makes 2 of us." "It feels too deliberate," Sara continued. "Like the signal was waiting for someone to notice it. And those energy readings, they shouldn't exist. Not after we destroyed the hive mind's control node." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the stars, his mind running through the possibilities. "If it's bait," we'll deal with it. If it's something worse, well, we've handled worse before. The shuttle exited FTL near the planet, its engines humming as it approached the source of the signal. The planet's surface was barren, its atmosphere thin and tinged with faint red hues. As they descended, the crew spotted something unusual, a sprawling settlement nestled in a valley, its structures glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "That's human architecture," Sara said, her voice tinged with awe. "But it's different, like it's been altered." The settlement was a mix of familiar designs and alien influences, the buildings pulsing faintly with a red-tinged energy. Jack felt his stomach tighten. The last time he'd seen something like this, it had been inside the hive mind strongholds. As the shuttle landed, the team disembarked cautiously, their weapons at the ready. The air was eerily still, the only sound the soft hum emanating from the buildings. Jack led the way, scanning the area for signs of movement. They didn't have to wait long. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form humanoid but unnervingly graceful. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and its movements were almost too smooth. "Welcome," it said, its voice calm and even. "We've been expecting you." Jack tightened his grip on his weapon. "Who are you?" The figure smiled faintly. "I am Dr. Elias Rendell. I was the head scientist of this colony when it was established, and you, Sergeant Livingston, are a long-awaited guest." "How do you know who I am?" Jack demanded. "Because we've been watching," Rendell said, gesturing for them to follow. "Come, there is much to discuss." As they moved deeper into the settlement, more figures appeared, men and women, all with the same glowing eyes and unnervingly fluid movements. The settlement was alive with alien technology, its systems humming with energy that felt both familiar and foreign. Sara kept close to Jack, her unease growing with every step. "This isn't right," she whispered. "These people, they're not fully human anymore." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "Stay sharp." Rendell led them into a central chamber, its walls lined with screens displaying streams of alien data. A massive, pulsating device sat at the center, its red glow casting eerie shadows across the room. "This colony was lost," Rendell explained, "but it was never abandoned. When the hive mind's technology first infiltrated our systems, we fought it. We failed. But rather than destroy us, it offered us something greater." Jack's stomach turned. "You merged with it." "Yes," Rendell said, his tone reverent. "We became something more, an evolution of humanity, one capable of harnessing the hive mind's power without succumbing to its control." Sara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "And what about the people who didn't want to merge?" Rendell's smile faltered. "There were difficulties. Not everyone could adapt." Jack raised his weapon. "What do you want from us?" "To join us," Rendell said simply. "Humanity's future lies in integration. The hive mind is a tool, not an enemy. Together we could rebuild it, better, stronger, and under our control." Jack shook his head. "We've seen what your tool can do. It's not worth the risk." Rendell's glowing eyes narrowed. "Then you leave us no choice." Before anyone could react, the room erupted in chaos. Alarms blared, and the settlers' calm demeanor vanished as they moved within human speed, their bodies contorting in ways no human should. Sara grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him toward an exit. "We need to get out of here, now!" As they fled, the settlement seemed to come alive around them, its structures shifting and pulsing with energy. Jack fired at the settlers chasing them, but his shots barely slowed them down. "This isn't a colony," Sara shouted. "It's a hive." Endless corridors stretched before them, the walls pulsating like veins. Jack's comm crackled with static, drowning out the voices of the other team members. It felt as if the hive itself was trying to isolate them. Just as escape seemed impossible, a brilliant blue light cut through the chaos. Ships descended from the sky, their sleek designs unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. From one of the ships emerged a figure with luminous skin and an aura of calm authority. "We are the Lorathians," it said, its voice resonating in their minds. "We've come to help you destroy this mistake before it spreads." Jack and Sara exchanged a glance, their relief tempered by the enormity of what lay ahead. Humanity's war was far from over, but this time they weren't fighting alone. The Lorathian's voice resonated in Jack's mind, calm yet firm, carrying an undercurrent of authority that was impossible to ignore. The settlers, once closing in on Jack and Sara with inhuman speed, froze mid-stride. Their glowing red eyes flickered as if something unseen had seized control of their movements. "You have disrupted them," Rendell said, his voice trembling as he stared at the blue-skinned figure. "You shouldn't be here." The Lorathian tilted its head, studying Rendell with a detached curiosity. "Your kind meddles with forces it cannot hope to master. We warned others like you centuries ago. None listened, and they paid the price. You will fare no better. This colony," it said, gesturing to the glowing structures around them, "is merely the latest iteration of that infection." Rendell stepped forward, defiance etched into his features. "You're wrong. We've mastered it. We've bent it to our will." The Lorathian's gaze turned cold. "You have enslaved yourselves to it. You are no longer human." Jack stepped between Rendell and the Lorathian, his mind racing. "If this thing is a fragment, what happens if we destroy it here? Will it stop spreading?" "For a time," the Lorathian said, "but unless the core intelligence is eradicated, its fragments will always reemerge." Rendell scoffed. "Eradicated? You don't understand what you're talking about. This isn't a disease. It's evolution. We've transcended humanity's limitations, unlocked potential your kind can't even fathom." Sara turned to Rendell, her voice sharp. "At what cost? The people here, did they have a choice? Or did you force this on them?" Rendell's eyes burned with frustration. "They resisted at first, yes, but their resistance was rooted in fear. Fear of progress, fear of the unknown. Once they understood what they could become—" "They didn't have a choice," Sara said, cutting him off. Her voice trembled with anger. "You took that from them." Jack glanced at the settlers, still frozen but clearly alive. Their glowing eyes stared vacantly, their bodies standing eerily still. "If you're so evolved, why did you send that signal? Why ask for our help?" Rendell hesitated, his confidence faltering. "Because we underestimated the strain. The network is unstable. The fragment is growing beyond our ability to contain it." "So you dragged us into your mess," Jack said, his voice cold. "And now you expect us to fix it?" Before Rendell could respond, the Lorathian stepped forward, its voice commanding. "There is no fixing what has been done here. This settlement must be destroyed, and the fragment with it." "No," Rendell shouted, his glowing eyes flaring brighter. "We've come too far. I won't let you take this from us." As Rendell's voice rose, the settlers around him began to stir, their bodies jerking unnaturally as if waking from a trance. Jack raised his rifle instinctively, his pulse pounding. "Back off, Rendell," Jack warned. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "You don't understand," Rendell roared. "We are the future. You're clinging to a dying past." The settlers surged forward, their movements chaotic and violent. Jack fired the first shot, his plasma round striking one of the glowing figures square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall, its movements quickening as though the injury only made it angrier. "Fall back!" Jack shouted, grabbing Sara's arm and pulling her toward the Lorathian's ship. The settlers swarmed around them, their numbers overwhelming. The soldiers behind Jack and Sara opened fire, their weapons blazing, but the glowing figures pressed on relentlessly. It was like fighting shadows. No matter how many they hit, more seemed to emerge from the buildings around them. The Lorathian stepped into the fray, raising a hand. A pulse of blue energy erupted from its palm, rippling outward and sending the settlers sprawling. "Move," it said, its voice calm but urgent. "They will recover quickly." Jack, Sara, and the remaining soldiers followed the Lorathian toward its ship, firing as they went. Rendell's voice echoed through the settlement, filled with desperation. "You can't stop it. The network is too strong." As they boarded the Lorathian ship, Sara turned to the alien. "What do we do? If this thing is part of a larger network, how do we stop it?" The Lorathian's luminous eyes darkened. "You cannot. Not yet." "That's not good enough," Jack snapped. "If this thing spreads, it'll be on every colony within months. We need a solution." "There is a solution," the Lorathian said, its tone measured, "but it is not one your kind is ready for." Jack stepped closer, his frustration boiling over. "Then make us ready." The alien regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "This fragment must be severed from the network completely. To do so, we must destroy not only the settlement, but all connected systems, including your ship." Jack's blood ran cold. "You're saying we have to die for this to work?" "No," Sara interjected, her voice steady. "There has to be another way. We've integrated alien tech before. If we can isolate the fragment's signal, we might be able to suppress it. The Lorathian tilted its head, intrigued. Your understanding of the hive mind's technology is rudimentary, but your proposal is not without merit. Then let us try, Sara said firmly. Give us access to your systems. We can figure this out together. The Lorathian hesitated, then nodded. You have one chance. If you fail, I will act. Sara immediately moved to the ship's console, her fingers flying across the unfamiliar interface. Jack stood behind her, his rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the Lorathian as it monitored the glowing settlement below. What happens if we do nothing? Jack asked quietly. The Lorathian's voice was grave. The fragment will continue to grow, assimilating all it touches. Within a decade, it will reach critical mass, and the greater intelligence will take notice. Your galaxy would not survive. Jack swallowed hard, his chest tightening. No pressure, huh? Sara worked furiously at the console, the alien interface glowing faintly as she navigated through layers of data that seemed to shift and pulse like a living organism. Jack stood behind her, his eyes scanning the room, watching the Lorathian and the other soldiers. Outside the viewport, the glowing settlement seemed to pulse in tandem with the signals she was analyzing, the eerie synchronization setting his nerves on edge. Talk to me, Sara, Jack said, his voice low but urgent. What are we looking at? It's a mess, Sara muttered, her fingers flying over the controls. The settlement's systems aren't just broadcasting, they're pulling in data from somewhere else. This fragment isn't operating in isolation. It's still connected to something larger. The Lorathian stepped closer, its luminous gaze fixed on the console. The fragment seeks to re-establish its link to the greater network. It is incomplete and unstable, but it is learning. Jack frowned. Learning what? Us, Sara answered, her voice tight. It's using every signal we've sent, every action we've taken, to rebuild its understanding of humanity. It's adapting. Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. So, it's not just waiting for the hive mind to find it, it's trying to become the hive mind. The Lorathian nodded. Precisely. It is why this settlement must be eradicated. Sara paused, her hands hovering over the console. Not yet. If we destroy it now, we lose the chance to understand it. We might be able to sever its connection without wiping out everything. Jack stepped closer to her. And if you can't? Sara glanced back at him, determination blazing in her eyes. Then we blow it to hell. The Lorathian ship hovered over the settlement as Sara continued her work, her focus unbroken despite the tense atmosphere. The remaining soldiers stood near the entrance, their weapons at the ready in case the settlers made another move. Jack paced behind Sara, his nerves taut as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, Sara let out a breath. I've got it. What? Jack asked, leaning over her shoulder. There's a core signal, something central to the settlement's operations. If we can disable it, we'll disrupt the fragment's ability to self-organize. It'll cut off its link to the larger network and leave the settlers disconnected. The Lorathian stepped forward, its expression unreadable. If the signal is severed, the fragment will collapse. But the settlers who are part of it, they will not survive. Jack's jaw tightened. There's no way to save them? Sara hesitated, her voice quiet. Not if they're as integrated as I think they are. The fragment's network is their lifeline now. Jack looked out the viewport at the settlers moving below, their glowing forms weaving through the buildings. He thought of Rendell's words, of the people who had resisted and been forced into assimilation. They didn't choose this. No, they didn't, Sara said. But if we let this fragment grow, it'll take a hell of a lot more than this colony. Jack nodded, his voice grim. Then we do what we have to. The team descended into the heart of the settlement, accompanied by the Lorathian. The alien's presence seemed to keep the settlers at bay. They moved in the shadows, watching but not attacking. The pulsing glow of the buildings grew brighter as they approached the central structure. A towering spire of alien and human architecture fused together. This is it, Sara said, stopping in front of a massive door. She scanned the structure with her handheld device, her brow furrowing. The core is inside, but the defenses are complicated. Complicated how? Jack asked. Biological, Sara replied. It's not just tech, it's alive. The defenses are part of the fragment itself. Jack cursed under his breath. So, it's not going to let us shut it down without a fight. The Lorathian stepped forward, placing a glowing hand on the door. The structure shuddered, and the door began to open, revealing a cavernous chamber filled with pulsating red light. The air was thick with the hum of energy, and Jack felt an almost physical pressure in his chest as they stepped inside. At the center of the room was the core, a massive, pulsating sphere of light and tendrils, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid. Jack could feel its presence in his mind, an insidious whisper that grew louder with every step. "This thing's alive," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice shaking. Sara moved to a nearby console, her hands steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. "Keep it off me," she said, her tone resolute. "I'll disable the signal." Jack raised his weapon, scanning the room as the settlers began to emerge from the shadows. Their movements were frantic, almost desperate, as if they could sense what was about to happen. "They're coming," Jack said, his voice tight. "Get ready." The settlers surged forward, their glowing forms moving with unnatural speed. The soldiers opened fire, their plasma rounds cutting through the air. Jack focused on covering Sara, his shots precise and controlled as he held the settlers at bay. "Whatever you're doing, Sara, do it faster," Jack shouted over the chaos. "I'm working on it," Sara snapped, her fingers flying over the console. The Lorathian moved with an otherworldly grace, its blue energy pulses scattering the settlers and creating temporary barriers. "The fragment is resisting," it said. "It knows what you are trying to do." Sara let out a frustrated noise. "I need more time." Jack gritted his teeth as a settler lunged at him, its glowing eyes wild. He fired a burst of plasma, sending it sprawling, but more were coming. "Time isn't something we've got a lot of." The core began to pulse more violently, its light intensifying as if it were preparing to defend itself. The whispers in Jack's mind grew louder, almost deafening, and he could see the strain on the others' faces as they fought to stay focused. Suddenly, Sara's console emitted a sharp beep. "Got it!" she shouted. "The signal's severed." The core let out a piercing wail, and the chamber shook violently. The settlers froze mid-attack, their bodies convulsing as the light in their eyes flickered. The core's tendrils thrashed wildly, its surface cracking and splintering as the fragment collapsed in on itself. "We need to move," Jack shouted, grabbing Sara's arm and pulling her toward the exit. The team sprinted out of the chamber as the structure began to collapse around them, the settlers dropping lifelessly to the ground. The Lorathian followed close behind, its movements swift and deliberate. As they emerged into the open air, the central spire imploded, sending a shockwave through the settlement. The glowing buildings dimmed, their energy fading as the fragment's influence was extinguished. Jack and Sara stood together, their breaths heavy as they watched the settlement crumble. The Lorathian stepped forward, its luminous gaze fixed on the ruins. "You have severed the fragment," it said, "but this is only a beginning." Jack turned to the alien, his expression grim. "What do you mean?" "The greater intelligence will notice this disruption," the Lorathian said. "It will send another fragment, or worse, your kind must prepare." Jack glanced at Sara, her face pale but resolute. "Then you'd better help us." The Lorathian nodded slowly. "We will, but humanity must understand. This war is far from over." Jack looked back at the ruins of the settlement, the weight of their actions settling heavily on his shoulders. The fight against the hive mind was only just beginning, but for the first time, they weren't alone. The ruins of the settlement still smoked faintly as the Lorathian's ship hovered above the scorched ground. Jack stood outside the ship, staring at the remnants of what had once been a desperate experiment in survival, or perhaps something far darker. The bodies of the settlers lay scattered, their glowing eyes dim and lifeless. For all the chaos they had caused, they had been people once. Now they were just another casualty in humanity's war with the hive mind. Sara emerged from the ship, her face pale but resolute. She had spent the last hour poring over the data they'd salvaged from the settlement's core. Jack turned to her, his expression grim. "Did we get anything useful?" he asked. Sara hesitated, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes and no. I managed to isolate fragments of the signal patterns the core was using to reconnect with the greater network. It's like a breadcrumb trail leading back to something bigger. But I don't know if it's the original hive mind or just another fragment waiting to wake up." Jack frowned. "Can we follow it?" We could, Sara said, her voice uncertain. But the Lorathian's right. If we chase this signal, we might be walking straight into something we're not ready for. Jack exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as he considered their options. We've been playing defense ever since this started. Maybe it's time we took the fight to them. Sara opened her mouth to respond, but the Lorathian's voice interrupted her. The alien had approached silently, its glowing form casting faint blue light over the desolate landscape. You are correct, the Lorathian said, its voice resonating in their minds. To delay is to invite greater danger. The signal must be followed, but not recklessly. The path ahead is treacherous, even for us. Jack crossed his arms, meeting the alien's gaze. What's out there? What aren't you telling us? The Lorathian tilted its head, the movement strangely fluid. The hive mind is not one intelligence, but many. Fragments like the one you destroyed here are seeds, planted to grow and adapt. The core intelligence lies far beyond this galaxy, but each seed draws from its power. What you face now is a shadow of what is to come. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. So we're dealing with an advanced recon force. If they're this dangerous, what happens when the main force shows up? The Lorathian's glowing eyes dimmed slightly. Extinction. Sara's voice cut through the heavy silence. Then we have no choice. We have to find the source of this signal and destroy it before it can reconnect. The alien regarded her for a long moment. I will guide you, but understand this. Even if you succeed, the core intelligence will not stop. You will have bought time, nothing more. Time's all we need, Jack said firmly. If we can keep them on the back foot, we've got a chance to figure out how to end this for good. The Lorathian inclined its head. Very well, prepare yourselves. The journey ahead will test you in ways you cannot imagine. The journey began hours later, the Lorathian ship cutting through the void with an elegance that left Jack and Sara in quiet awe. The crew of the ship, a mix of human soldiers and alien operators, moved with precision, their roles clear despite the differences in their origins. Jack spent most of the journey in the briefing room, studying the maps and projections the Lorathians had shared. Sara, as always, buried herself in her work, dissecting the fragments of data they had pulled from the settlement. You're going to burn yourself out, Jack said, leaning against the doorway of her quarters. Sara glanced up from her console, her expression equal parts exhaustion and determination. I'll rest when we're not on the edge of annihilation. Jack smirked faintly, stepping into the room. That's what you said last time, and the time before that. Someone has to stay ahead of this thing, Sara replied. The hive mind's tech is evolving faster than we are. Every second counts. Jack sat across from her, his expression softening. You've done more than anyone could ask, Sara, but you're not going to solve this alone. Sara met his gaze, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I know. I keep thinking about what Rendell said, about evolution. What if he was right? What if fighting this thing is like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket? Then we make the bucket bigger, Jack said with a grin. We've beaten impossible odds before. We'll do it again. Sara laughed despite herself, the tension in the room easing. You're impossible. And you wouldn't have it any other way, Jack said, his voice warm. The signal led them to the edge of known space, where the stars grew sparse and the void seemed to stretch endlessly. The Lorathian ship slowed as they approached the source, a massive, jagged structure floating in the blackness. It was unlike anything Jack had ever seen, its form a chaotic blend of sharp angles and flowing organic shapes. The entire structure pulsed faintly with red light, like a heartbeat. This is it, Sara said, her voice hushed. This is where the signal's coming from. Jack leaned closer to the viewport, his gut twisting with unease. What the hell is that? The Lorathian stepped forward, its luminous eyes fixed on the structure. A relay. It serves as both a beacon and a node, transmitting the fragment's signals back to the core intelligence. Jack frowned. So if we destroy it, we cut off the connection? Temporarily, the Lorathian said, but the relay is heavily defended. The fragment's drones will protect it at all costs. Jack turned to Sara. Can we take it out? Sara nodded, her jaw set. If we can get inside, I can overload the core systems, but we'll need to hold off the defenses long enough for me to work. Jack looked at the Lorathian. Can your people handle that? The alien inclined its head. We will do what is necessary. As they prepared for the assault, the tension among the crew was palpable. The human soldiers checked their weapons and armor, their movements brisk but careful. The Lorathian operators moved with quiet precision, their calm demeanor a stark contrast to the humans' visible anxiety. Jack stood with Sara near the ship's armory, going over their plan one last time. "You're sure you can handle this?" he asked. Sara gave him a faint smile. "I've handled worse. Just keep the drones off me, and we'll be fine." Jack nodded, his expression serious. "Stay close to me. No heroics." "Funny," Sara said, raising an eyebrow. "I was about to say the same thing to you." Jack laughed, the sound lightening the tension for a moment. Touché. When the assault began, the void erupted into chaos. The relay's defenses activated the moment the Lorathian ship approached, unleashing swarms of drones that moved with terrifying speed and precision. The ship's weapons blazed, cutting through the swarms, but the drones kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Jack and Sara led a small strike team aboard a smaller transport vessel, weaving through the chaos as they approached the relay. The transport shook violently as enemy fire peppered its shields, but the pilot held steady, maneuvering them toward a breach in the relay's outer defenses. The moment they landed, Jack's instincts kicked in. He raised his rifle, scanning the dark, pulsating corridors ahead. "Let's move. Sara, stay close." The team advanced cautiously, the hum of the relay's systems growing louder with every step. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. When the first wave of drones appeared, the team opened fire, their plasma rounds cutting through the metallic bodies. Jack stayed at the front, his focus unshakable as he cleared a path for Sara. "Core's close," Sara said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Just a few more meters." "Make it quick," Jack said, firing at another drone as it lunged toward them. The firefight grew more intense the deeper they ventured into the relay. The pulsating corridors seemed alive, the walls shifting slightly as if responding to their presence. Jack pushed forward, his weapon firing in short, precise bursts. Drones clattered to the ground, their glowing cores flickering out as they fell. "Sara, how much farther?" Jack shouted over the sound of gunfire. 50 meters, she called back, her scanner in one hand and her pistol in the other. Her voice was calm, but Jack could see the strain on her face. "The core's shielded. I'll need at least 5 minutes to override the failsafe." Jack cursed under his breath. 5 minutes was a long time in a place like this. "You heard her," he shouted to the team. "We hold the line until she's done. No one lets anything through." The team reached the core chamber, a vast, circular space dominated by a massive sphere of pulsing red energy suspended by tendrils of living metal. The hum of the relay was almost deafening here, a low, throbbing sound that seemed to vibrate in Jack's chest. The chamber was dimly lit, the only light coming from the core itself and the faintly glowing pathways that snaked along the walls and floor. Sara sprinted to the nearest console, her fingers flying over the alien interface. "Cover me," she shouted without looking back. Jack planted himself between Sara and the chamber's main entrance, his rifle trained on the doorway. The rest of the team took up defensive positions, their weapons at the ready. The Lorathian remained near the core, its luminous form glowing faintly as it monitored the energy flow. The first wave of drones hit moments later. They poured into the chamber, their glowing red eyes fixed on the intruders. Jack opened fire, the plasma rounds from his rifle cutting through the front line of attackers. The drones were relentless, their movements precise and coordinated. For every one they took down, 2 more seemed to appear. "They're trying to overwhelm us," one of the soldiers shouted, firing frantically at the swarm. Jack didn't answer, his focus locked on the fight. He fired in controlled bursts, aiming for the glowing cores that powered the drones. "Stay sharp, don't let them split us up." Behind him, Sara worked furiously, her hands a blur as she bypassed the relay's security protocols. "Almost there," she shouted. "Just a little more time." Jack risked a glance over his shoulder. "No pressure, but we're running low on time." As if on cue, a second wave of drones surged into the chamber, these larger and more heavily armored than the first. They moved with terrifying speed, their limbs sharp and blade-like. Jack's rifle barely slowed them down, the plasma rounds glancing off their reinforced shells. "We need heavier firepower," one of the soldiers shouted as he struggled to reload. The Larathian stepped forward, raising one glowing hand. A wave of blue energy rippled outward, slamming into the oncoming drones and sending them sprawling. "Focus your fire on the cores," it said, its voice calm despite the chaos. "They cannot function without them." Jack gritted his teeth and aimed for the cores, his shots more deliberate now. The drones fell one by one, but their numbers seemed endless. He glanced back at Sara, who was still working at the console. "How much longer?" he called. 2 minutes, she shouted, her voice tight. Jack turned back to the fight, his jaw clenched. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. He fired again and again, his rifle growing hot in his hands. The drones kept coming, their movements becoming more erratic as the relay's energy levels fluctuated. Then, without warning, the chamber shook violently. The core pulsed brighter, its tendrils thrashing wildly. Jack stumbled, barely keeping his footing. "What the hell was that?" "The core's destabilizing," Sara shouted. "I've almost got it." The Larathian moved closer to the core, its luminous form glowing brighter. "The fragment is resisting. It knows what you are trying to do." Jack fired at another drone, his muscles aching from the relentless pace of the fight. "Tell it to take a number," he snapped. Finally, Sara let out a triumphant shout. "Got it! The failsafe's down. I'm initiating the overload now." The core's pulsing grew erratic, its light flickering as Sara's commands took hold. The drones faltered, their movements slowing as the relay's systems began to collapse. Jack lowered his rifle slightly, his chest heaving as he took a moment to catch his breath. "Is that it?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the core let out a deafening roar. The tendrils thrashed violently, and the chamber shook again, this time more violently. The flickering light intensified, casting the room in a blinding red glow. "We need to get out of here," Jack shouted, grabbing Sara's arm. "Now!" The team sprinted for the exit, the Larathian close behind. The chamber collapsed around them, pieces of the ceiling crashing to the floor as the core's energy spiraled out of control. Jack pushed Sara ahead of him, his eyes scanning the crumbling corridor for any sign of danger. They barely made it back to the transport as the relay erupted in a massive explosion. The shockwave rocked the ship, sending it spinning before the pilot regained control. Jack and Sara collapsed into their seats, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Did we do it?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. Sara nodded, her face pale but determined. "The signal's gone, the fragment's dead." The Larathian stood nearby, its luminous eyes fixed on the viewport. "You have succeeded," it said, "but the greater intelligence will notice this disruption. It will send others." Jack looked at Sara, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll be ready." The transport hummed softly as it distanced itself from the crumbling relay. Jack sat across from Sara, catching his breath. His mind buzzed from the intensity of the mission, but his eyes lingered on her as she worked to stabilize the data stream she'd salvaged before the overload. Sweat glistened on her forehead, and as she leaned forward to adjust her scanner, her movements caught his attention. Her curves filled the tight utility suit in a way that seemed almost unfair, and for a fleeting moment, Jack found himself distracted. The way she focused on her work, oblivious to the chaos she had just survived, was impressive, but his gaze betrayed where his thoughts had wandered. He remembered the crude comment he'd overheard from a crewman weeks ago. "She could bump that thing into me anytime." At the time, Jack had brushed it off with irritation. Now, the memory surfaced unbidden, and he couldn't help but notice what had inspired the remark. "Enjoying the view?" Sara asked suddenly, her voice dry but amused, without even looking up. Jack blinked, caught completely off guard. "What? No, Sara finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Relax, Livingston, I'm just messing with you." He chuckled awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Right, messing with me, great," Sara smirked, but her expression softened after a moment. "Seriously, thanks for having my back out there. Couldn't have done it without you." Jack leaned back in his seat, his nerves settling. "You kidding? You're the brains of this operation. I'm just here to look intimidating and shoot things." "Right," Sara said with a teasing grin, "because you're so intimidating." Jack grinned back, the tension from earlier easing into something more comfortable. "Hey, I've got my moments." Sara shook her head with a laugh, turning back to her console. Jack watched her for a moment longer before forcing himself to look away, focusing instead on the viewport and the distant stars. The Lorathian ship's command deck was quiet as they approached Kepler Horizon. Jack stood beside Sara as they reviewed the salvage data. The alien structure had left behind traces of its network, a tangled mess of signals that hinted at a larger, more organized system still operating beyond humanity's reach. "This isn't good," Sara muttered, scrolling through the data. The relay wasn't just a node, it was a hub for coordinating fragments across this sector. Jack frowned. "So, what happens now? Do those fragments just wake up?" "Not immediately," Sara said, her tone grim. "But they'll notice the disruption. We might have slowed them down, but we didn't stop them." The Lorathian approached, its luminous form casting a faint blue glow over the console. "The fragments will adapt," it said. "This is their nature. You have bought time, but the greater intelligence will eventually send more tendrils." Jack turned to the alien, his jaw tight. "How much time do we have?" The Lorathian's eyes dimmed slightly, as though in thought. "Months. Perhaps a year. The core intelligence is vast and ancient. Its responses are deliberate but relentless." Sara crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. "If we can track the fragments, we might be able to isolate more hubs, hit them before they fully reestablish contact." Jack nodded. "You think you can find them?" Sara hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but I'll need access to every scrap of data we've got. Kepler Horizon's archives, Earth's databases, everything." "You'll have it," Jack said firmly. "We'll make this work." Kepler Horizon buzzed with activity when they returned. The story of the destroyed relay spread quickly, boosting morale across the colony. For the first time in weeks, people seemed to believe they had a fighting chance. Jack and Sara, however, knew the truth. The fight was far from over. In the days that followed, Sara buried herself in her work, coordinating with the Lorathian and other engineers to analyze the salvage data. Jack divided his time between training new recruits and assisting with preparations for the next potential threat. But no matter how busy he was, his thoughts often drifted back to Sara. One afternoon, Jack stopped by the colony's main lab to check on her progress. He found her hunched over a console, her back to him. Her utility suit clung to her figure in a way that made him hesitate, an uncharacteristic warmth rising to his face. Shaking his head, he cleared his throat. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorway. "How's it going?" Sara turned, a faint smile on her lips. "Progress is slow, but it's progress. The Lorathians have been surprisingly helpful once you get past the whole cryptic alien wisdom thing." Jack stepped closer, glancing at the screen. "Anything we can use?" "Maybe," Sara said, her tone cautious. "I've identified some patterns in the fragment's signals, potential paths they might use to reconnect. If we're lucky, we can use those paths to find the remaining hubs." "And if we're not lucky?" Jack asked. "Then the fragments use those paths to spread faster than we can stop them," Sara said, her voice grim. She leaned back against the console, crossing her arms. "This isn't just about fighting back, Jack. It's about keeping up with something that evolves every time we hit it." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Sara smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple," Jack said. "Just possible, especially with you on our side." Sara laughed softly, shaking her head. "You really know how to butter someone up, don't you?" "Only when it's true," Jack said, his tone light but sincere. The moment hung between them, unspoken but not unnoticed. Finally, Sara broke the silence, turning back to her work. "You'd better get back to your recruits. If this data pans out, they'll be seeing action sooner than later." Jack smirked, stepping toward the door. "I'm on it. Don't work too hard, Johnson." "No promises," she called after him. Jack left the lab with a renewed sense of purpose. As much as the Lorathians' warnings had unsettled him, they also offered a grim clarity. Humanity wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to stay ahead of a threat that was faster, smarter, and relentless. But there was something comforting in the thought, too. They'd faced the hive mind before and won. Maybe not completely, but they'd held their ground. And they still had one trick up their sleeve, a tactic that had worked before, and one he was certain could work again. Jack made his way to the command center, where Commander Hayes was overseeing the latest reports from other colonies. She glanced up as he entered, her sharp gaze immediately honing in on him. "Livingston," she said, "I assume this isn't a social visit." "Not this time," Jack replied, stepping up to the central console. "I've been thinking about the drones we repurposed during the first attack on Kepler Horizon. They were crude, but they worked. What if we could do the same thing on a larger scale?" Hayes folded her arms, intrigued but skeptical. "You're suggesting we weaponize mining drones again?" "Not just weaponize them," Jack said. "We adapt them to hunt the fragments. Sarah's been analyzing the signal paths these fragments are likely to use. If we could deploy drones along those paths, they could act as early detection systems or even interceptors." Hayes frowned. "And how would these drones stand a chance against the fragment's defenses?" Jack smirked. "We make them expendable, arm them with payloads that can disrupt the fragment's networks. Bursts, signal scramblers, anything we can rig up. They don't have to survive. They just have to slow the fragments down long enough for us to strike." Hayes considered this, tapping her fingers against the console. "It's risky. If the fragments adapt too quickly, we could lose those drones before they're effective." "That's why we don't just throw them in blind," Jack said. "We use the same strategy we did with the hive mind's first stronghold: overload their systems. Hit them where it hurts, and force them to react." Hayes nodded slowly, a spark of approval in her eyes. "All right, I'll authorize the retrofitting of a new drone fleet. But you'll need Sara and the Lorathians to fine-tune the tech." Jack grinned. "They'll love it." Hayes gave him a wry look. "Just make sure it works." Back in the lab, Sara was skeptical at first. She paced the room as Jack outlined his idea, her hands on her hips as she processed the plan. Jack tried not to let his gaze wander, but the way her utility suit hugged her figure made it hard to focus. He forced himself to keep his tone steady. "So what do you think?" he asked, leaning against the console. "Crazy enough to work?" Sara stopped pacing and turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "It's not the worst idea you've had." "That's high praise coming from you," Jack said with a smirk. Sara rolled her eyes, but there was a faint smile on her lips. "Theoretically, it could work, but we'd need to upgrade the drone's targeting systems to lock onto the fragment's energy signatures. That means pulling in more resources from Kepler Horizon's main grid." "Do it," Jack said. "We'll worry about the grid later. Right now, we need something that can punch through their defenses before they can adapt." Sara nodded, already moving to her console. "All right, let's see what we can rig up." The next few days were a blur of activity as Sara and her team worked to retrofit the mining drones. With input from the Lorathian, they managed to adapt the drone's desktop systems to detect and disrupt fragment signals. Each drone was outfitted with a small EMP payload and a rudimentary AI that allowed it to maneuver through hostile environments. Jack spent most of his time in the hangar, overseeing the retrofitting process and running simulations with the new drone fleet. The Lorathian observed quietly, offering occasional suggestions, but otherwise letting the humans lead. Jack appreciated its restraint. It was strange having an alien ally, but so far, the Lorathian had proven invaluable. As the first batch of drones rolled off the assembly line, Sara joined Jack in the hangar, her face streaked with grease and exhaustion. Jack couldn't help but smile at the sight of her. She was brilliant, determined, and he had to admit, more than a little attractive. "You've outdone yourself," Jack said as she approached. "These things look like they could take on a whole fleet." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Sara said, brushing her hands on her utility suit. "They're good, but they're not invincible. The real test will be how they perform in the field." Jack nodded. "We'll find out soon enough. The fragments aren't going to wait for us to finish fine-tuning." Sara sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's always like this, isn't it? We barely finish one fight before we're thrown into another." "That's war," Jack said. "But at least we've got each other." Sara gave him a tired smile. "Yeah, at least there's that." The drone's first deployment came sooner than expected. One of the signal paths Sara had identified lit up with activity. A fragment was moving through uncharted space, its energy signature growing stronger by the hour. Jack and Sara joined the strike team tasked with intercepting it, bringing a small fleet of retrofitted drones along for the mission. The Lorathian ship carried them to the edge of the signal path, where the fragment's energy distorted the surrounding space. The air aboard the ship was tense as the team prepared for the fight ahead. "Remember the plan," Jack said as the drones were launched from the ship's hangar. "The drones go in first. Once they disrupt the fragment's defenses, we move in and finish the job." The crew nodded, their faces set with determination. Sara stood beside Jack, her gaze fixed on the viewport as the drones disappeared into the void. "You nervous?" Jack asked, his voice low. "A little," Sara admitted. "This is uncharted territory, literally and figuratively." Jack grinned. "Good, keeps us on our toes." The drones reached the fragment moments later, their onboard systems locking onto its energy signature. The fragment was a massive, shifting mass of tendrils and glowing cores, its form constantly changing as it adapted to the drone's presence. The first wave of drones detonated their EMP payloads, sending ripples of energy through the fragment's structure. "It's working," Sara said, her voice filled with relief. "The fragment's destabilizing." "Let's move," Jack said, signaling the strike team. "Stay tight, watch each other's backs." The team advanced toward the fragment, their weapons ready. Jack stayed close to Sara, his rifle trained on the writhing mass of alien tendrils. As they approached, the fragment let out a piercing wail, and a swarm of drones emerged from its core. "Here we go," Jack muttered, opening fire. The battle was fierce, the fragment's drones moving with terrifying speed and coordination. But the retrofitted mining drones continued to disrupt the fragment's network, giving the team the opening they needed. Jack fired in controlled bursts, his focus unshakable as he protected Sara. "I need a few more seconds!" Sara shouted as she worked to deploy a secondary EMP charge. "You've got it," Jack called back, taking down another drone as it lunged toward them. The charge detonated, and the fragment let out one final, deafening wail before collapsing in on itself. The battlefield fell silent, the only sound the team's ragged breaths as they surveyed the aftermath. "We did it," Sara said, her voice shaky but triumphant. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression warm. "You did it." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "No, Jack, we did." The silence that followed the fragment's collapse was heavy, filled with the weight of victory and exhaustion. Jack stood with Sara, his rifle still in his hands as his eyes scanned the void where the fragment had been. The swirling remnants of energy slowly dissipated, leaving behind an eerie calm. The retrofitted drones hovered idly, their payloads spent but their presence a testament to humanity's ingenuity. Sara dropped to one knee, pulling out her scanner to analyze the fading energy signatures. "It's completely gone," she said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and fatigue. "The fragment's connection to the network is severed." "Good," Jack replied, his gaze lingering on the distant stars. "Let's hope it stays that way." The Livingston approached, its glowing form casting soft blue light over the scene. "Your strategy was effective," it said, its voice resonating in Jack and Sara's minds. "But this victory is temporary. The greater intelligence will take notice." "We expected that," Sara said, standing and brushing herself off. "The goal was to buy time, and I think we've done that." Jack turned to the alien, his expression resolute. "Then tell us what we can do to make the next fight count. You've been holding back. If there's something we don't know, now's the time to tell us." The Livingston's luminous eyes dimmed slightly, a sign Jack had come to recognize as hesitation. "There is another way to weaken the hive mind," it said, "but it is dangerous. Even we have not attempted it." Sara crossed her arms. "What kind of danger are we talking about?" The Livingston gestured toward the fading energy remnants of the fragment. "The fragments are not merely extensions of the core intelligence. They are also its memories. Each one carries pieces of the hive mind's past, its knowledge, its history, its weaknesses. If you could access that information—" "You mean hack into its mind?" Sara said, her eyes widening. "That's insane. Even if it's possible, the hive mind could retaliate before we get anything useful." Jack frowned, his jaw tightening. "How would we even pull that off?" The Livingston tilted its head. "You would need to capture a fragment before it fully establishes itself. It would require precision, speed, and resilience. But if you succeed, you could uncover information that would allow you to strike at the core intelligence directly." Sara shook her head, her tone incredulous. "That's a suicide mission. The fragments are unstable, and we've barely been able to destroy them, let alone contain one. Jack looked at Sara, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, but if we could pull it off, it could change everything. Sara sighed, rubbing her temples. You're serious about this, aren't you? Dead serious, Jack said. We've been playing defense for too long. It's time we hit back. The return to Kepler Horizon was quiet, the team too drained to celebrate their victory. Jack spent the journey in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars. Sara joined him after a while, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him without a word, sitting beside him on the narrow bench. Thanks, Jack said, taking a sip. Sara leaned back, her gaze fixed on the viewport. You really think we can pull this off? Jack turned to her, his expression thoughtful. I don't know, but I think we have to try. If we can get inside their network, find something we can use. Sara nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the mug. It's risky, the kind of risky that gets people killed. Jack smirked faintly. Since when has that stopped us? Sara let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You're impossible, and you're brilliant, Jack said, his tone soft but sincere. I wouldn't even consider this if I didn't have you on my team. Sara turned to him, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the tension of the past few weeks melted away, replaced by a quiet connection that neither of them had to put into words. Finally, Sara broke the silence with a wry smile. Well, if we're doing this, you'd better be ready to keep up. Jack grinned. I'll do my best. Over the next several days, preparations for the mission consumed the colony. Sara worked tirelessly in the lab, developing containment protocols and modifying the retrofitted drones to assist in the capture of a live fragment. Jack divided his time between training the strike team and coordinating with the Livingston, who provided invaluable insight into the hive mind's behavior. The tension in the air was palpable as the team prepared to depart. Jack stood in the hangar, watching as the drones were loaded onto the transport ship. Sara joined him, carrying a datapad filled with schematics and notes. You ready for this? Jack asked, his tone casual but his eyes serious. As ready as I'll ever be, Sara replied. She hesitated, then added, You? Jack smirked. Always. Sara rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in her expression. Just don't do anything stupid out there, okay? I'll try, Jack said, but you know me. That's what worries me, Sara replied, shaking her head with a laugh. The mission began under the cover of darkness, the transport ship gliding silently through the void. The fragment they were targeting had just emerged in a nearby system, its energy signature still weak. Sara monitored the readings from the command console, her fingers flying over the controls as she directed the drones into position. Jack stood behind her, his rifle slung across his back. How's it looking? Fragile, Sara said. It hasn't fully stabilized yet. If we hit it now, we might be able to contain it before it adapts. Then let's not waste time, Jack said, turning to the team. You know the drill. Keep it contained, no matter what. The drones moved in first, their EMP payloads creating a barrier that disrupted the fragment's energy flow. Jack and the team followed closely, their weapons at the ready, as they approached the writhing mass of tendrils and light. The fragment pulsed violently, its form shifting as it sensed the intrusion. Stay sharp, Jack called, firing a warning shot at a tendril that lashed toward the team. Sara, you good? Almost there, Sara shouted, working quickly to deploy the containment field. The modified drones circled the fragment, emitting a high-pitched frequency that caused the tendrils to recoil. The fragment's movements grew more frantic, its pulsing light intensifying. Jack fired another round, his focus unshakable as he protected Sara. Whatever you're doing, make it fast! Done, Sara yelled, slamming her hand down on the console. The containment field activated, surrounding the fragment in a shimmering bubble of energy. The tendrils thrashed against the barrier, but it held firm. Jack exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. We got it. For now, Sara said, her voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. But this is just the beginning. The containment field hummed faintly, the fragment thrashing against its shimmering walls like a caged animal. Tendrils of energy lashed out, but the field held firm, the drones maintaining the precise frequency needed to suppress the fragment's unstable form. Jack stood a few feet away, his rifle still in his hands, scanning the room for any sign of additional threats. "We've got it contained," Sara said, her voice strained but triumphant. She stood at the console, her fingers typing rapidly as she monitored the fragment's energy levels. "But it's not going to stay like this forever. The field's holding, but it's drawing a lot of power. If we're going to pull anything useful out of this thing, we need to do it fast." Jack stepped closer to her, glancing at the data streams on her screen. "What's the plan?" Sara straightened, taking a breath. "The fragment's energy patterns are still connected to the hive mind's larger network, but it's unstable, like a frayed wire. If I can isolate a clean signal, we might be able to trace its connection back to the source." "And by source, you mean the core intelligence?" Jack asked, his tone cautious. "Exactly," Sara replied. "It's a long shot, but if we can pinpoint where the signals are originating, we might finally have a way to hit them where it hurts." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "Do it. We'll cover you." The team moved into position, forming a defensive perimeter around Sara and the containment field. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the drones and the occasional crackle of energy from the fragment. Jack kept his eyes on the doorway, his muscles tense as he scanned for movement. "Sara," he said quietly, "you're sure this is safe? You're not going to, I don't know, link up with this thing accidentally, are you?" Sara glanced up at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Relax, Jack. I've got this." Jack exhaled, forcing himself to trust her. She'd pulled off the impossible before. He had no reason to doubt her now. As Sara worked, the fragment's thrashing began to subside, its energy shifting into a rhythmic pulse. The data streams on her console grew more coherent, the fragmented signals resolving into something recognizable. "Got it," Sara said, her voice low but steady. "There's a primary signal buried in here, stronger than anything we've seen before. It's like a beacon, guiding the fragments back to their origin." Jack stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the screen. "Can you trace it?" Sara nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm trying. The signal's faint, but it's there. If I can boost the field's resonance, I might be able to." The fragment let out a sudden, piercing wail, its tendrils flaring with violent energy. Sara stumbled back, her hands clutching the edge of the console. "What's happening?" Jack shouted, raising his rifle. "The fragment's destabilizing," Sara yelled, her voice panicked. "It's fighting back." The room erupted into chaos as the fragment lashed out, its energy surging against the containment field. The drones strained to hold the barrier, their engines whining under the pressure. Jack fired a shot at a rogue tendril that broke through, the plasma round disintegrating it mid-air. "Sara, can you shut it down?" Jack called over the noise. "I'm trying," Sara shouted, her hands a blur as she worked to stabilize the field. "If I can just—" Before she could finish, the fragment emitted a blinding pulse of light, and the room went silent. Jack blinked, his vision swimming as the brightness faded. When his eyes focused again, he saw Sara slumped against the console, her breathing shallow. "Sara!" Jack shouted, rushing to her side. He crouched beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her shoulders. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Sara murmured, her voice weak but steady. "Just dizzy, the fragment. Did it?" Jack glanced at the containment field. The fragment was still inside, its energy subdued but flickering faintly. The drones had stabilized, their hums returning to a steady rhythm. "It's still contained," Jack said, relief flooding his voice. "But you scared the hell out of me." Sara gave him a faint smile, her eyes fluttering open. "You're the one who said we'd figure it out." Jack chuckled softly, helping her to her feet. "Yeah, but I didn't mean you had to almost fry yourself to prove it." Sara steadied herself against the console, her expression serious. "Jack, I got it, the signal. It's coming from outside the galaxy, a system on the fringe of the Andromeda cluster." Jack's eyes widened. "Andromeda? That's way beyond anything we've ever explored." "I know," Sara said, her voice trembling slightly, "but it's the origin point. If we're going to stop the hive mind for good, that's where we have to go." The team returned to Kepler Horizon with the data Sara had pulled from the fragment. The Larathian confirmed her findings, its luminous eyes darkening as it studied the signal's origin. Jack, Sara, and Commander Hayes gathered in the colony's war room to discuss their next move. "The Andromeda cluster," Hayes said, her voice heavy with disbelief. "That's uncharted space. We don't even have long-range probes that can reach that far." We'll have to take the Larathian ship, Sara said. It's the only thing in our fleet capable of making the journey. Hayes frowned. And once you get there, what happens if this core intelligence is waiting for you? Jack leaned forward, his gaze steady. We'll do what we've always done. Adapt, improvise, and fight like hell. Hayes studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right, you've got my authorization, but this is a one-way trip. You understand that? Jack glanced at Sara, who gave him a small, resolute nod. He turned back to Hayes, his expression unwavering. We understand. The Larathian ship prepared for departure, its sleek silver hull gleaming under the harsh lights of Kepler Horizon's launch bay. Jack and Sara stood together on the observation deck, watching as the final supplies were loaded onto the vessel. You ready for this? Jack asked, his voice quiet. Sara gave him a wry smile. Not even a little, but that's never stopped us before. Jack laughed softly, shaking his head. No, it hasn't. He hesitated, then turned to her, his expression serious. Sara, I know I don't say this enough, but I couldn't do this without you. You're the best damn engineer I've ever met, and the best friend I've ever had. Sara's smile softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. Jack, you're not getting sentimental on me, are you? Jack smirked. Maybe a little, but I mean it. I know you do, Sara said. She hesitated, then added, and for what it's worth, I couldn't do this without you either. Jack nodded, his chest tightening. Then let's make it count. Together, they boarded the ship, the door sealing behind them with a hiss. The engines roared to life, and the Larathian ship lifted off, its sleek form disappearing into the void. Their mission was clear. Their enemy was relentless. But as long as they had each other, Jack knew they stood a chance. The hum of the Larathian ship's engines filled the quiet as it sped toward Andromeda. Jack sat in the observation deck, staring out at the dark expanse of uncharted space. He'd spent countless hours here since their departure, thinking about the battles they'd fought and the one that still lay ahead. But tonight, his thoughts were heavier than usual. The crew was small, Sara, a handful of elite soldiers, and the Larathian guides. The plan was ambitious: track the core intelligence, infiltrate its stronghold, and destroy its central hub. If they failed, it wouldn't just be the end of their mission. It could mean the end of humanity's chance to fight back. Jack exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. The weight of it all pressed down on him, sharper and heavier in the quiet moments. He'd always considered himself a soldier, not a leader, not a strategist, just someone who could get the job done. But this mission wasn't about following orders. This was on him. Every decision, every risk, every casualty, they all came back to him. You're doing that thing again, a familiar voice said behind him. Jack turned to see Sara leaning against the doorway, a faint smile on her face. She held 2 mugs of coffee, offering one to him as she crossed the room. He accepted it with a grateful nod. What thing? He asked, taking a sip. Brooding, Sara said, sitting beside him. Staring into space like the weight of the galaxy is on your shoulders. Jack smirked faintly. Funny, I don't remember assigning you to the morale division. Sara laughed, nudging his shoulder. Somebody has to keep you from imploding. Besides, I'm the one who keeps this whole operation running. Jack gave her a sidelong glance. And here I thought I was the brains of this outfit. Sara snorted. You're lucky you're cute, Livingston. Otherwise, I'd take you down a peg. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. You'd miss me if I wasn't around. Probably, Sara admitted, her smile softening. But don't let it go to your head. The playful exchange eased some of the tension Jack had been carrying, but as Sara sipped her coffee, her expression grew serious. You're not alone in this, you know, she said quietly. We're all in it together. Jack nodded, his gaze drifting back to the stars. I know, I keep thinking about what happens if we fail. What happens if we don't come back? Sara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. We will, and even if we don't, Kepler Horizon will. Humanity will. This isn't just about us, Jack. It's about giving them a chance. Her words sank in, steadying him. Jack looked at her, his chest tightening with gratitude. You're right. You always are. Sara grinned. Don't you forget it? The Andromeda cluster loomed ahead, its swirling star systems both beautiful and foreboding. The Larathian ship slowed as it approached the coordinates Sara had extracted from the fragment. On the main display, a massive structure came into view, a sprawling fortress of shifting metal and pulsating energy. It was the hive mind's central hub, its surface alive with tendrils of light that reached out into the void like grasping fingers. Jack and Sara stood on the command deck beside the Larathian. The alien's glowing form dimmed slightly as it studied the fortress. "This is the core intelligence's nexus," the Larathian said. "Its thoughts, its plans, its power, all converge here." "And its defenses?" Jack asked. "Formidable," the Larathian replied, "but not insurmountable. If you strike at the central node, you will disrupt the network permanently." Sara frowned, scanning the display. "What happens to the fragments if we destroy the node? Do they just die?" "No," the Larathian said. "They will become disconnected, directionless. Some will collapse, but others may linger, adapting in isolation. It will take time, but humanity will have the advantage." Jack turned to the alien, his expression hard. "And what about your kind? You've been helping us, but we don't know why. What's your endgame in all this?" The Larathian tilted its head, its luminous eyes meeting Jack's. "Our purpose is balance. We have seen what happens when the hive mind consumes unchecked. Entire civilizations vanish, leaving only silence. We fight because we must, but we do not seek conquest or dominion. Our survival depends on the survival of others." Jack studied the alien for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough, but if this mission succeeds, we're going to need more than balance. We'll need allies." The Larathian's glow brightened slightly, a sign Jack had come to recognize as approval. "If you succeed, you will have our aid. Humanity's resilience has proven unexpected." Jack smirked faintly. "We're full of surprises." The mission began with an assault on the fortress's outer defenses. The Larathian ship launched waves of drones, each armed with EMP payloads designed to disrupt the hive mind systems. The fortress responded with swarms of its own drones, their glowing forms moving with terrifying speed and precision. Jack and Sara led the strike team aboard a smaller transport, weaving through the chaos as they approached the fortress. The transport shook violently as enemy fire peppered its shields, but the pilot held steady, maneuvering them toward a breach in the fortress's defenses. Inside, the corridors were alive with the same pulsating energy they had seen in the fragments. Jack kept his rifle at the ready, his heart pounding as he led the team deeper into the fortress. Sara stayed close behind him, her scanner sweeping for the central node. "It's up ahead," Sara said, pointing to a massive chamber on her display. "But the energy readings are off the charts. Whatever's in there, it's not going to let us walk in." Jack nodded. "Then we'll make some noise. Team, hold the perimeter. Sara and I will take out the node." The chamber was vast, its walls lined with shifting patterns of light. At its center stood the node, a massive, crystalline structure pulsing with an intense, blinding energy. Tendrils of light extended from the node, connecting it to the walls and floor like a living organism. As Jack and Sara approached, the node let out a deafening wail. Drones swarmed into the chamber, their movements erratic but deadly. Jack opened fire, his shots precise as he cleared a path for Sara. "Cover me," Sara shouted, sprinting toward the node. She slid to a stop beside a console, her hands moving rapidly as she worked to bypass its defenses. Jack fired at an oncoming drone, his focus unshakable. "How long?" "2 minutes," Sara called back. "You've got one," Jack retorted, taking down another drone as it lunged toward her. The node's tendrils lashed out, striking the ground with explosive force. Jack gritted his teeth, firing at the tendrils to keep them away from Sara. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he refused to let himself falter. "Almost there," Sara shouted, her voice strained. The node let out another wail, and the chamber shook violently. Jack stumbled but quickly regained his footing, firing at a drone that had broken through the line. "Sara, now would be good." "Got it," Sara yelled, slamming her hand down on the console. The node's light flickered, its tendrils convulsing as her commands took hold. The fortress began to collapse around them, its systems failing as the node's energy destabilized. Jack grabbed Sara's arm, pulling her toward the exit. "Move. Now." They sprinted through the crumbling corridors, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The transport was waiting for them at the breach, its engines roaring as it prepared for takeoff. Jack and Sara leapt aboard just as the fortress erupted in a massive explosion. The return to Kepler Horizon was bittersweet. The hive mind's network had been destroyed, but the cost weighed heavily on the team. As they stepped off the ship, the colony's residents gathered to greet them, their faces a mix of relief and hope. Commander Hayes approached, her expression unreadable. "You did it," Jack nodded, his exhaustion evident. "For now." Hayes's gaze softened. "You gave us a fighting chance. That's more than anyone could have asked for." As the crowd dispersed, Sara lingered beside Jack. She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "We did it." Jack turned to her, his chest tightening. "We did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sara smiled, her hand brushing against his. "You're not so bad, Livingston, for a soldier." Jack grinned. "And you're not so bad for a genius." She laughed softly, her eyes meeting his. "Let's not make this a habit, huh?" "No promises," Jack said, his voice warm. As they stood together, the stars above seemed just a little brighter. The war wasn't over, but humanity was ready for whatever came next.